I'm here at the park again, walking around, barefooted. Um, Ground's a little cold, and I wanted to talk about a spiritual topic, kind of. Not really spiritual. What I want to talk about is the I want to talk about the theme of holiness, I suppose. But in particular, I'd like to talk about a certain channel toward holiness, as I've heard it said, and I'm trying to remember as I'm talking. I believe anywhere that I had read it written that by some saint or other, some medieval saint or other, that holiness is advanced by treating the here's the core point, the basic core point. Treating the faults of others as, rather than as thorns, as opportunities to show charity. So, in the Thomistic understanding of Christian virtue, or of any virtue, there are 7 total virtues, 4 cardinal virtues and 3 theological virtues. And they advance, the virtues advance from least to greatest. With prudence being the least great, you could say, but also fundamental virtue. It's not really least to greatest. It's more foundational to more divine. So prudence is the basic virtue and the foundation of the other virtues, of all of the rest of the 6. And then charity is the pinnacle of the entire septet. And this channel I'm talking about of sanctification, you could say, has to do with this pinnacle virtue of charity, which is a more specific word than love. Because, for instance, in Greek there are 3 words for love. In English we just have the one, love, but there is there's brotherly love, or filial love, and over it goes, Philadelphia story. And then there is eros, which is not erotic love, but rather love of something for the sake of its beauty, something like that. As well as communal friendship love, which isn't as tied to obligation as is filial love, as far as I understand it. I'm probably butchering, but that's my. I've heard such things explained in greater detail. I suppose it's worthwhile to just try my best at describing my own understanding, even if it's wrong. In any case, treating of others' faults as opportunities to display charity, to show love, not in any particularly grandiose way. Quite the reverse, really, the showing of charity, meaning chiefly to think of the other person and not oneself. In other words, to think about the turmoil that must be introduced into another person's life by way of a given fault or vice or mistaken attitude or ingratiating habit of one kind or another, or grating habit, rather. Or, the habit of being overly ingratiating, or any number of things that we can find fault in our neighbor for. So I wanted to look at that thought, and then I had some kind of what I thought to be a corollary thought, which I'm trying to now bring into sharper focus, which I think is related to the notion that when it comes to one's own faults, one can begin to treat oneself the way that saint from medieval times would seek or have us seek to treat others. So in other words, understanding your faults in the very first place, but then from there, after some understanding of one's faults is achieved, that interior knowledge is achieved, to then so when that interior knowledge is achieved to some extent, of course it's never perfectly achieved. How could it be? Because perfect understanding of the faults would entail perfect virtue. But clearly perfect virtue is never achieved, or hardly ever achieved except by the most holy of saints. But the strange thing, almost the cliche joke about saints, is that they never consider themselves to be holy, much like heroes never consider themselves to be heroes, but rather see holiness in the divine, and have shifted, those who have advanced into holiness have shifted their focus, goes the basic catechetical understanding, have shifted their focus from the self to others. But how is that to be understood? Because it could one could misinterpret such a sentiment and overcompensate in the direction of becoming a kind of victimhood warrior or something, or even in a more casual way, even if one is not branded in any sense by being that kind of a false Christian, in other words, one who allows charity the facade of doing charity to supersede the act of charity itself. As it says in the Gospels, do not let your right hand see what your left is doing, or the other way around. When you give money to a beggar, just give it silently and walk away. Is sort of the sentiment there, or not even for a beggar, but any act of charity at all. The opening of a door for someone, even, or helping a neighbor, an elderly neighbor, with a task of some kind, whatever it may be. I remember reading and then rereading the final novel by Camus, who gets a really bad rap for being cynically jaded and so on, but his final novel is actually good, in my opinion. It's much better than The Plague. In that novel, the main character, the whole novel is told in first-person narration, by way of a conversation. The whole thing's a dialogue, actually. The whole novel's a dialogue, but within that dialogue, a great deal of first-person narration takes place from the main interlocutor with this old man at a bar in Amsterdam. And he describes, the great pride he would take in helping a woman retrieve her suitcase from above her chair, and the great pride he would take in being involved in this or that charitable organization, and how he would even have a glow of pleasure and pride late at night, lying in his bed before falling asleep, a burning sort of pleasure he would experience, and as he thought of how he had sacrificed his time and his energy to aid those less fortunate and capable than himself. And how this sort of interior movement of the soul is not something that he was himself aware of until much later. That as he was experiencing this burning pleasure of pride before falling asleep at night alone in his dark bedroom, he would not. It's a funny thing with pleasure in general, that we often take pleasure without knowing that we are taking pleasure, and various things that we may even consider to be outwardly unpleasurable, but have a the Lacanian term would be surplus enjoyment, but trying to avoid that kind of terminology. What you might call it is simply, and to use more basic language, might simply call it a kind of vanity. But vanity tends to evoke a person, often a woman, in front of the mirror, pruning themselves, applying lipstick, say, or eyeliner, puckering one's lips after the application of lipstick, and lingering at the mirror overlong. It's a fairly good image, but it doesn't fully capture the extent of vanity as a whole. You might say is a kind of vain glory, more so than vanity proper. A vain glory, like that is an imitation of true glory, So true glory being, had at the victory of a battle that was righteously won against an enemy that was to be defeated, either figurative or literal. Glory, might call it peak experience, to bring in yet more psycho jargon, but glory versus vain glory. So it is not a glorious thing to give money to a beggar. It would be far more glorious if beggars did not exist. But given the action of giving, it could be very well be a vain glorious action. More truly, it can be an act of charity, but charity does not imply glory necessarily, even if charity leads ultimately to glory, or there's some kind of extended relationship there to be explored. Charity is often inglorious, in fact, or can be perceived rather. It's not actually inglorious, but can be perceived as inglorious, or charity, when it seeks not the presentation of itself as charity, but rather the betterment of another human soul. If such actions require some level of clandestine intercession or intervention, then situations very well may arise where there's a question of whether the one acting charitably is doing anything good at all, since his charitable actions are not recorded on a ledger or written on a stone tablet, or acknowledged by society. Right. And if the one acting charitably has other faults of his or her own, then those might be held against one, as they so often are, and might indeed be exacerbated and seem worse, or become worse even. If charity is practiced to the point of exhaustion, even in small ways, even in somewhat mysterious ways, one might just as well say. So, in any case, this notion of treating the faults of others as opportunities to show charity implies some level of self-sacrifice. The sacrifice, and that all charity, in the Christian theological sense of the term, of the concept, all charity is based in some level of self-sacrifice. Whereas all prudence is directed at some level of self-preservation. So, prudence is the foundation for a building, you could say, for the building of all virtues. And, any of the virtues might as well rattle off, fortitude being defenses and defensive walls, security systems, such a building. Courage and intemperance being the thoughtful attempts to moderate influences that could unduly stress the structural integrity of the building, say, or those who inhabit it. But faith, hope, and charity, the three theological virtues, have not to do with the structural integrity of the building, in other words, of the human being, your own security and safety, but rather what that human being can do to imitate God in the expression of virtuous action, not for the sake of the building any longer, but for the sake of other buildings. So it's the building a bakery, it's the building a mill, is the building a pharmacy, is it a house, or what? Well, that's the thing, is it wouldn't really be a house unless the house is in some way open and giving to the wider community. And, businesses, say, or homes, are much like human beings, can operate in one of two mind frames, one being total self-preservation in the practice of the four cardinal virtues to the point of excellence and of self-preservation, survival, but also flourishing in a more material, but also mental, psychological kind of a sense. And those human beings, as well as businesses or institutions or families, which overflow, luminesce so much with virtue that the cup overfloweth in a human soul, as well as a collection of human souls arranged and collected for any given purpose, originating from wherever such things originate. So in the seeing of the faults of others as examples to show charity, it's much like a collection of like a business or a home that intercedes for the wider community and at points of need, at points of struggle, that doesn't simply glut the palate and pave the city streets and strengthen schools for better SAT scores, or make glorious plans of war and conquest, but instead directs its chiefest energies, its most chiefliest energies, to the salvation of that which is broken, or that which, if rendered functional, if resurrected, if aided, if nursed, if given some level of self-sacrificing caritas would flourish not for the sake of bounty, but for the sake of greater life and more abundant life, and as well as the deepening of the human spirit, the human soul. For the greater and betterment, goodness of all persons, of all people, everywhere. Not by way of, geopolitical intervention, but simply by way of, the telephone game way of human goodness that cascades out into the world. Why does everyone know about Jesus Christ? You might ask, in relation to this all. If he was just a man like many others, from a certain historical period, like many other certain historical periods. Who underwent great strain and popular animosity as well as sympathy, like so many other figures who have undergone great strain and experienced varying levels of popular antipathy and sympathy. Why, if not that Christ did not just perform a magic show for crowds, but inculcated a spirit of charity. He gave a commandment of love to those who followed him. A new commandment he gave to love. It's a commandment. And the showing of charity, even if it doesn't bring, what the vainglorious one seeks, the demonstration of charity does bring its own reward, does produce a spiritual reward. Which is exactly what vainglorious actions badly mimic. And in fact, showing of charity imbues one with a certain level of authority, not in a worldly sense in the slightest, but except perchance as God allows Christian virtue to find some afterglow of expression in the winning of hearts and minds and good relations, but it's a very dodgy thing. But the reward is still, but even still, in a way that is entirely separate from worldly types of authority. A kind of interior authority is achieved, not a kind of universal authority one could walk out and direct at anybody, but an authority due the one giving charity from the one who is receiving it. But after one is on the receiving end of a great act of charity, one feels like the sense can often be that, if someone has really helped you out in a situation where they didn't have to, and no one else was going to, the reaction in gratitude ought to be one of a sense of holy obligation to that person. And if no good action can be done for the person who did the good action for you in this situation, then the only way to repay one's neighbor who has acted well is to pass it on. Just like that corny movie starring that kid from the 90s. Pass it on. Such a funny movie. Where this little boy comes up with a scheme where he's going to do 3 favors for people, and all they have to do is do 3 favors for 3 other people. And before you know it, we're all singing Kumbaya around the bonfire, toasting marshmallows. The Jews and the Arabs are all chill. You know, Israel gets turned into paradise on earth. The Gaza Strip is turned into a carnival. Everybody's invited to a giant party. The Congo becomes the #1 destination spot globally, and everybody has money to be a tourist somehow, magically. But so it's not really that simple, obviously. But I think that corny movie does more crudely express what in actuality does happen, which is somewhat mysterious. Since charity as a virtue is somewhat mysterious, and is expressed in ways that are never really spoken aloud, is exercised in ways that are never really articulated, or even that easily articulable. Despite my best efforts to articulate the inarticulable. So, main kind of point I was trying to draw from all of that was sort of selfishly directed. I'm trying to think about treating one's own faults as opportunities to express self-charity, I suppose you could say. Which is a sort of problematic notion. Self-love is sort of a problematic notion. Because if love is based in self-sacrifice, then it doesn't really make sense to self-sacrifice yourself for yourself. So, is vainglory then a misbegotten attempt to hoard charity for oneself? Something like that. I'm just gonna leave off talking about this now. After trying to say one more thing, which is that I think solitude, being separate, Christ would always separate himself from the apostles to pray alone. And all the great Zen monks and people who have achieved interior peace advocate some level of physical detachment, or if that's not possible, then mental detachment. Maybe not detachment, because detachment sounds like a negative thing, but really the notion is solitude, of when one is present with people, one does not want to be detached, but one wants to literally detach into solitude. To gain in virtue somehow, seems to be the notion. Gain in, well, you know, it's like how Mr. Rogers said in an interview one time, how he always took the very first hour of the morning for himself. Christian spiritual practice always, of course, recommends at least 30 minutes a day spent in solitary prayer. Because the thing about vainglorious activity is, like that described in Camus' The Fall, is it's a form of distraction and over-attachment, over-involvement. And that's always the funny thing with charity. It's before it becomes the actual physical giving of help, or in order to ever be the actual giving of help, perhaps you could say, to get to that point, one has to at first, in a state of solitude, ideally, even if that's just approximate solitude, if one's life is too hectic to either sitting on a bus alone, you know, or what have you. I mean, and the anonymity of a city, sitting on a bus with others, being in a state of silence. Silence, solitude. That this gives birth to a kind of, it almost seems like a kind of self-love, and what ought to be, I'm trying to say that like a good thing, where self-love, l'amour propre, Rochefoucauld, self-love, bad, selfishness, self-love, but like Mr. Rogers spending an hour every morning, or saints, prophets, being apart. Itself leads to somehow to the growth in charity. It's the growth in the willingness to self-sacrifice, and small and little and real, literal and somewhat figurative senses. Perhaps simply because solitude is itself an act. It's a kind of sacrifice. A confrontation with one's interior state, and thus one's own flaws, with the hazardously poignant and sometimes anxiety producing state of sort of encounter, confrontations, encounter with one's own state, producing a state of being somewhat ill at ease. Why are we ill at ease when we are alone? Why must we flood ourselves with encounters of one kind or another, online or in the real world? Why not simply be alone? I mean, why am I talking right now rather than remaining silent? It's a good question, and I don't really have a good answer for it, other than that I try to do this sort of video, this kind of talk, almost as if it was a kind of prayer. course, it's not directed directly at God, but it's almost like I'm just kind of giving a sort of sermon, something that I myself want to hear primarily, and then I am curious and happy if anybody else finds value in anything I have to say. Anyway, that's it.